Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
1 hour, 4 stories. It's gonna be a good night. Before I go on my break and share these fascinatingly creepy work stories with you, let me give you one good reason why you should always drink Dead and Roasted over Dunkin' Donuts. Because I had some Dunkin' Donuts earlier today. True story. Got a small cold brew. It tasted like uranium. An hour later, I stood up from the couch and I swear I shifted dimensions, or my heart was trying to fly out my rear end. I'm pretty sure somebody spiked my coffee with espresso ground and super concentrated from the very center of the earth. If anyone has any idea how that might happen, let me know. Otherwise, I'm gonna stay far away from Dunkin' before it kills me. Now then, those stories I promised. Prepare for an epic struggle in a barn between a young farmhand and an unknown creature, a psychotic story about Hubert the clown, and more. These are tales from the break room. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you should review the show because leaving us an honest rating helps us reach new listeners. You can also subscribe on YouTube if you haven't already. Just look for Darkness Prevails. Something watching over her. From Mr. Hayward. I work in disability support, mainly with those that have mental disabilities and behavioral problems. These can range from anything from severely autistic clients to those with schizophrenia. The house I currently work in has 5 clients, all sometimes violent, but much less so than they used to be. I've come to really care for my clients over the many years I've worked with them. So when my boss called me one night, asking if I could fill in the sleepover shift, I felt obligated, and I said yes. It was around 7 p.m. when I arrived, which meant most of the clients had taken themselves to bed. Over the next hour as we worked, my boss explained what had happened earlier with the staff woman supposed to be doing the sleepover. Apparently, while helping one of the older clients use the toilet, she had slipped on the wet floor and smashed her shoulder into a wall. My boss thought this was strange, as the floor had been dry when she went in to check on the fallen staff. And what's more bizarre, my boss said, she seemed hell-bent on getting out of the house, just kept saying she was not staying here. I asked how badly her shoulder was injured. My boss responded that no one knew just yet. The staff woman was still at the hospital, waiting for x-rays. She added that, oddly, 2 small bruises had formed on her chest, nowhere near the impact site of her shoulder. Pictures had been taken of the injuries for reporting purposes, so I was able to see them. Indeed, 2 small bruises the size of a baby's hands were present. My boss led me into the open bathroom where the accident had happened and pointed out the large crater in the wall. This was next to the toilet and nowhere near the shower or sink. Why would this part of the bathroom floor be wet? As interesting as this mystery was, we both had paperwork and cleaning to do. And to be honest, I didn't much care for that particular staff woman. I thought she was too abrupt, too rough with the older clients. Around 8 p.m., my boss signed off and wished me an easy sleepover. I found that most of my sleepovers were pretty easy. The clients generally only got up to use the toilet overnight, and only one of them needed assistance to do so. A certain client, I'll call Noodle, was currently shuffling her way down the hallway to the office, where I was typing at the computer. Noodle had lived a hard life, suffering from schizophrenia and autism, which made it difficult for her mother to care for her the older and more violent she became. So Noodle was placed in an institution at a very young age. A terrible place that just over-medicated and abused her. At one point, she was the most violent client in the state. This led to her being isolated away from everyone, even the staff. She was never really given any chance to develop beyond her violent behavior, until the institution was closed down. Then she came to this house, where for many years the staff has built a relationship with Noodle. Now she's just a cute little old lady. She hadn't even had a violent outburst in 2 years. Noodle poked her head around the office door and said, "Dirty." I told her to go to the toilet and I would follow along. Noodle only spoke with 1 to 3 words, so the meaning to her words was usually easy to figure out. Dirty meant she needed to go to the toilet, and she needed help. I walked behind her up the very long east hallway, putting on some gloves. The house was massive, divided into east and west wings, with 2 bathrooms and 2 lounges, 4 bathrooms each end. The hallways have small sensor lights at ground level, which only illuminate small patches of the floor. This is so clients don't fall or get lost in the dark, trying to find a light switch or door handle. Noodle went into the bathroom and sat on the toilet. I turned the bathroom light on and jumped back at the sight of Noodle's baby doll sitting next to the sink. Regina was a very old and tattered baby doll, given to Noodle by her mother when she was very little. Seeing the doll reminded me that Noodle's mother had passed away recently. I bowed my head in silence for a moment. Noodle's mother always spoke to me on the phone like she had known me all her life. She had told me about her daughter as a little girl, the pain in placing her in the institution, and the rage when she found out how they had abused her. She always ended the call by asking me to hug Noodle and tell her her mother loved her, and I always did. I missed Noodle's mother, and I was glad that Noodle herself did not understand the concept of death. It would break my heart to see Noodle grieve. I gave Regina the doll a salute and continued on to assist Noodle using the toilet. Once she was done, I tucked her into bed with her doll right next to her. She looked at the doll and said, "Numb." This was strange. She usually said num-num, and this was often just before meal times. She would sit at the dining table pointing to the kitchen saying num-num, requesting food. I assumed she wanted food, so I told her it was very late, but when she woke up in the morning I would make her a big breakfast. She closed her eyes and cuddled her doll. Around 11 p.m. I was awakened by the office door handle rattling violently in the dark. I knew immediately who it was. I got up out of bed and opened the door. "How can I help you, Noodle?" I yawned. She replied, "Dirty." And I followed her as she waddled up the dark hallway, setting off the floor sensor lights. I reached over her head at the bathroom door to turn the light on so she could see her way to the toilet. I got a new shield and the baby wipes from the cupboard and put them on the bench next to the sink. Turning my back to the sink, facing Noodle, I asked if she was finished. She usually would take off her soiled shield and stand to be cleaned. This time, however, she pointed at me and said, "Numb." Confused, I decided I would just change her shield myself. I was too tired. I turned and swore as I found Regina the doll sitting on the bench next to the sink. I wondered how tired I must have been to have not noticed her there before. "Regina, don't scare me like that," I mocked as I pulled the clean shield out from under her. "Numb," repeated Noodle as I cleaned and changed her. Again, I promised a big breakfast when she woke in the morning, while tucking her and the doll into bed once more. At 3 a.m., the office door handle rattled violently again. Groggily, I stumbled to the door in the dark. "Miss Noodle, how can I help you now?" I asked as I opened the door. I stared into an empty black hallway. She wasn't there. I did hear shuffling down the east hallway, so I leaned out to see a sensor light coming on. She must have gone toward the bathroom already. Walking up the hallway, I didn't see her little waddling frame, nor did I find her in the bathroom. I thought I'd better check her room, just in case. If she was in her room, who had set off the hallway sensor lights? It could be one of the other clients, I thought. Passing the other bedrooms on my way to Noodles, I checked every one. All the other clients were asleep and snoring. Very odd. I gently opened Noodle's door and turned her light on. I was shocked to find her on the floor and breathing rapidly. She had panicked eyes that stared up at me. "Sore," she whimpered, pointing to her chest. I raced back to the office and grabbed my phone, dialing 000 as I returned to Noodle, trying to comfort her and request an ambulance. Hours later, it would be confirmed that Noodle had suffered a heart attack. My boss had gone to the hospital to check on her, delivering to her her baby doll, Regina. I stayed awake until my shift ended at 10:30 a.m. I was worried about Noodle's well-being, but also wondering, if Noodle suffered the heart attack in her room, who had rattled the office door handle to alert me? The other clients were most definitely asleep. Just before I left for work, I was remaking Noodle's bed when I knocked a photo off the bedside table. It was a photo of a very young Noodle and her mother. When was this taken? I pondered, turning it over. Small, neat handwriting said, 1951, Noodle and numb. My blood ran cold and I felt sick. To summarize, the injured staff woman never came back to work. She gave no reason why, and even left some possessions there. I won't say it out loud to my colleagues, but I believe something happened between the injured staff woman and Noodle's doll. As for the doll, it's still here. Noodle still calls it numb, and sensor lights still come on at night, even when all the clients are sleeping. The Tailgater, from Rose Moo. I live in the panhandle of Florida, where fall is a strange blend of chilly mornings and sweltering afternoons. Growing up in the Northwest, I've always been a fan of Halloween and fall. I'm a horror fan. Films like The Conjuring always send chills down my spine. I'm probably more susceptible to fear. While I do want to believe in the paranormal, I still doubt it. One morning, though, on my way to work, something gripped me with dread, leaving me questioning everything. It was around 6 a.m. It was still quite dark out. A thick fog was rolling in, turning the familiar road into something out of a Stephen King novel. I was sleep-deprived and irritable after a restless night. I climbed into my car anyway. I drove down my driveway, then set my cruise control to 30, hoping a slow, nice, quiet drive would ease my mood. I sipped at my coffee and turned up the radio, just when a flicker of movement caught my eye in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or me being too sleepy. There were these dark shapes darting around like bats. There was something unnatural about them. They swept behind my car with a speed that sent a shiver down my spine. Leaning closer to the mirror, I squinted. The shapes were growing more chaotic, twisting into bizarre forms, and the longer I couldn't tell what they were, the more disturbed I felt. But then I saw headlights approaching, and I felt a lot better about not being alone. But that relief was short-lived, as the headlights grew larger, rapidly closing the distance. The driver behind me was soon tailgating me aggressively. I didn't want to pull over, afraid of what might happen if I did, as those dark shapes were still there. I kept glancing back, wondering if the guy was about to hit me. Eventually, I made it to the main road, and I stopped at a stop sign. I hurriedly turned, pushed the gas pedal down, and tried to escape. But the car behind me remained relentless, and the shadows around me seemed to only get worse, constantly flickering past my windows. I sped up, trying to reach my office where safety awaited. The next 15 minutes felt like forever. The sun was starting to rise, and just ahead, I spotted the dim glow of the community center and the silhouette of a police car parked in the lot. I pulled in quickly, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders as I left the road. The moment I put that car in park, the shadows vanished, and the fog began to recede. The tailgater didn't follow. Thank God. I exhaled a big, long breath and could feel my heart still racing. There was then a sudden knock on my window. I looked up to see the police officer. He looked concerned. With shaky hands, I rolled down my window. "Are you okay?" he asked. I told him what happened, describing the tailgater and the strange shadows. His expression turned to confusion. "Yours was the only car I've seen on the road in about an hour." I felt an intense chill then. Hesitantly, I prepared to head back onto the road to finish my drive to work. And to this very day, I wonder what in the world I saw. What happened to me? Or I guess, what almost happened to me. Once again, listeners, please don't send me creepypastas. I appreciate your writing, but this show is specifically for allegedly true stories. And if it's outright fake, like the following one seems, then it's not a good fit. But I went ahead and read this one just as a bonus, to top off the end of the episode. Enjoy. Hubert. From CLEB 193041. This happened 3 years ago. I was 20 years old and could not keep a job. I was just too lazy, I guess. Pretty soon I had a new one, though. I would be working at a place I'll just call the Hubert Amusement Park. Hubert was a clown, the mascot, and I would be him, or acting as him. Being the park's mascot was not a high-paying job, but at least I could live dressing up as a clown. Every day I would dress up as Hubert and go to the park. Like a typical clown, Hubert had pure white skin with red markings on his face, frizzy blue hair, a squishy red nose, and baggy rainbow overalls. I would arrive at the park at 6:45 a.m. to get ready, afterwards greeting people at the entrance. I made adults and kids alike smile, and sometimes I would make the little kids cry too. It wasn't always on purpose. Even though the job was kind of boring, the place was exciting for people. Flat rides, roller coasters, railways, water rides, dark rides, haunted houses, Ferris wheels, transport rides, and more. There was just so much to do in the wonderful place of Hubert's amusement park. I went on some of the rides as Hubert. It was fun, except that I went on the fastest roller coaster once and threw up during the ride. And because there was a loop, it all fell on the rest of the riders. I'm pretty sure those 12 folks aren't coming back. I would also sometimes go on stage and do these concerts. I would have to sing as Hubert. To me, it was kind of dumb. Why would anyone want to come and watch a weird clown singing pretty badly? But apparently I was wrong. A ton of people bought tickets just for stuff like that. There were some downsides to the job. Slowly, I was beginning to lose more and more sleep, and I wasn't sure why. One day, I just couldn't fall asleep, and in the morning, I was dog-tired. I would keep having this insomnia problem, and due to that, I began to see things. And yeah, they were just hallucinations brought on by lack of sleep. One day, I had a nightmare. I usually don't have nightmares. There was a dark shadow quietly zipping through the forests around the amusement park. It made this peculiar noise. Then I realized it was laughing. The dark shadow got closer in my nightmares, but I still couldn't tell what it was. Though I couldn't make it out, something I did notice was that it was carrying a pretty big sack. I remember in my nightmare, the dark shadow stopped moving. It threw the sack on the ground and pulled out a knife. It glinted in the darkness, and in its reflection, I could see blue hair. The shadow then unfolded its hands, revealing 7 more knives from the crevices of his fingers. It threw them one by one into the heart of that sack. The dream then shifted to a dark room. A dark shadow was hanging from a rope attached to the ceiling. There were knives stuck in its back, and blood on the walls. That's when I woke up. It was 4 a.m. and I could not sleep anymore. so I just sat there thinking about this nightmare. It was so detailed and felt very real. I decided to walk to work that day just to clear my mind. When I arrived, I went into the changing room so I could change into my Hubert outfit. I saw a newspaper lying on the table. I still couldn't get whatever that thing was out of my head, so I thought to hopefully not think about it while reading this newspaper. There were articles about famous entrepreneurs, car companies, TV shows, robberies, protesters, and a guy who had gone missing. I remember very well that the missing persons section caught my eye. I won't speak the name for the sake of privacy, so I'll just call him Joe. The remainder of the day was pretty normal. I was finally starting to forget about my nightmare, and I was having a good time as Hubert. Every day after that was the same, being Hubert, having fun, and being exhausted from a lack of sleep. I remember telling myself, sleep wasn't that important, I could just drink a coffee or something. A week passed by, then a month. There was a lot of drama about people going missing. The police sucked. Somehow they still didn't know how people were going missing, and because of that, folks around town were getting worried. One night after work, I went home and cooked myself a dinner, and as I did so, I heard a strange noise, a sort of thump. It came from my basement. I went to check it out, to be sure. I walked down the stairs, not prepared for what I was about to see. I turned on the light, and for some reason all but one light was off. And then I saw something. There was blood splattered on the walls, and just like my nightmare, things were hanging from the ceiling. People were hanging from the ceiling. All of them looked around the same age. They looked worse and worse the farther I walked down the line. Eyes gouged out, tongues cut in half, teeth gone, hair pulled out, knives in their backs, toes and fingers missing, gashes and stab wounds everywhere. I ran right back up the stairs and vomited. Then it came to me. I put the pieces together. It was me. I killed all these innocent people. That nightmare I had wasn't a nightmare, it was real. I disguised myself as Hubert and kidnapped these missing people on the news and murdered them. But why would I do that? I couldn't believe it. I would never do anything like that. Was I crazy? Out of panic, I called the police because that's how I was taught as a kid. I then realized that was a mistake. I wasn't thinking right. I just hung up, I froze, and couldn't move. The police did show up. They found what was in my basement. I told them it couldn't be me. It had to have been someone else. But in reality, I didn't know if it was me or not. They handcuffed me and put me in the police car. And then I saw something else. Right when the car began to move, there I saw Hubert. Hubert was holding knives in one hand and waving at me with the other. I didn't know who this other Hubert was and what they wanted with me, but by that point I was sure that I didn't do the killings. I frantically told the police that I just saw the real killer, but they didn't care. The locals thought I was insane. They put me on trial and I was put in this prison. I hate being here. I don't know for sure if I'm mental or not, but I do know that Hubert is real, and he's the one taking people. Trapped in the Barn, from Not Afraid of the Dark. I had an encounter that changed my life, or should I say nearly took my life, which happened in the great state of Washington. I was 17 years old at the time. It was back in 1997. I was visiting my grandparents for my summer stay, or as my family and I would call it, summer staycation. You see, I was born and raised in Washington in the town of Newport. It's a small town that borders Idaho. My grandparents lived south of us, in an even smaller town, north of Spokane and Coeur d'Alene. When I was around 8, my parents moved our family to Newport Beach, California. Yes, from Newport to Newport Beach, which we think is funny. All my siblings liked the move except for me. I loved the beach, but I missed everything back home. So each summer, I would return to Washington and spend the summer with my grandparents. That's why we called it my summer staycation. I spent each summer hanging out with friends and working on my grandparents' farm. They grew alfalfa, corn, apples, and Vidalia onions, and they raised about 400 sheep and 7 cows. Their farm covered 297 acres, roughly 60 acres of alfalfa, 47 for commercial dent corn, 70 for gala apples, and 30 for onions. The rest of the land wasn't very farm-friendly, as it was made up of forest and rocky hills. The sheep mostly grazed in the apple orchards, while the cattle roamed the hills and forested areas. They helped keep the weeds and vegetation down under the trees and loved eating the apples that fell to the ground. When people asked why they farmed multiple crops, the answer was simple. They once had a bad year relying on only potatoes, and the undersized crop led to losses. Each summer, my grandparents would teach me to operate different types of equipment. The best part of my summers there was driving tractors, 3-wheelers, and 4-wheelers. Most of the planting was done before my staycation began, but they let me use the tractors for various tasks. Around midsummer, we would cut the first batch of alfalfa, and I would stay up all night working. I often saw local wildlife in the fields, owls swooping through the tractor's lights to grab mice. On the edge of the field, I would see deer, elk, moose, and occasionally a mountain lion or a bear. Wolves were like ghosts in the surrounding forests. You could hear them howl, but you would rarely see them. The few times I did see them, they were off in the distance. It wasn't just my grandparents and me running the farm. They had about 10 seasonal ranch hands helping out. I was familiar with the local wildlife. Locals never talked about anything cryptid. Sometimes you would hear word about Bigfoot, but it was always with skepticism, or as a joke when teasing the local youth going camping. In 1997, when I had my encounter, I was planning to spend my senior year up in Washington. It took some convincing, but my parents finally agreed to let me move back to live with my grandparents. Little did I know that move would almost cost me my life. When you're farming, alfalfa is usually cut 3 to 4 times. Corn is harvested depending on moisture content, typically between September and late October, and onions are harvested in late August and early September. The apples are the hardest to harvest because it takes both machines and a lot of people. My grandparents usually hired local high school students and paid them by the bushel. I mention this because what happened took place during the apple and corn harvest season. I don't know how it happened, but part of the fence near the apple orchard and onions had been knocked down, and most of the sheep had wandered off. This had been discovered early one morning during apple picking. Several of my friends and I used the 4-wheelers to track down and retrieve most of the sheep. Then we repaired the fence. By mid-afternoon, we'd rounded up all but 6. My friends had to leave, and I went to talk to my grandparents, who told me to make sure I tracked down the last ones by the end of the day. I ate dinner and headed back out on the 3-wheeler, since all the 4-wheelers were being used to move apple trailers. I loved that 3-wheeler. It was older and had no speed governor, though parts were hard to find if it broke down. I rode along the east side of the property, where it was covered in forest and rocky hills. As I mentioned, my grandparents lived near the Idaho border, just a few miles from it. To give you a sense of the land, the southern and eastern parts of the farm were rocky hills with brush and trees, making it the worst part of the land. There were very few fences in that area, but if I saw the southern fence, I could get my bearings. That fence belonged to the Mendez family. They farmed a little wheat and a lot of alfalfa, and tracing their fence westward led to Amish family farms. To the north was a main road that bordered everyone's properties. As I headed east, I started my search where we had found the sheep earlier. Looking around, it was hard to tell where the remaining sheep could have gone, so I made my way to the top of a hill to get a better view. That didn't help much, so I searched for an area that sheep would naturally follow. The most likely path seemed to be at the bottom of the hill, which wrapped around to an old, half-finished rock quarry. The problem was that the quarry had filled with runoff and resembled a marsh. I cut across the hilltop and stopped at the top of the slope leading down to the old quarry. I flipped the kill switch on my three-wheeler, got off, and walked over to the edge before the slope tapered down to the marshy drop-off. It was quiet out there. I could feel a faint wind blowing past me toward the swamp, and I thought to myself, what an eerie sight. The exposed hill was dotted with sagebrush and loose rocks, weathered by time. Some large rocks looked like they could be rolled down into the marsh below. Part of the rock face was gray, but most of it was red. In the evening light, the whole area looked grim. I checked my watch. It was 7:47 p.m. The sun was about to set, and twilight was fading fast. I planned to return home, but my teenage self decided it might be fun to roll a few rocks down the hill first. I found a few basketball-sized rocks nearby and rolled them down. They caused a little shale to slide, but not much. So naturally, I looked for the biggest rock I could find, well, the biggest one I could move, and I ended up spotting one about the size of my three-wheeler. I pushed and pried, but could barely get it to budge. I needed more leverage, so I ran up the hill to look for a branch I could use. I broke one off a tree and made my way back down to the rock. It was still light enough to see clearly. As I was about to wedge the branch under the rock, I heard sheep bleating, one after another. They must be on the other side of the swamp, I thought. Knowing I couldn't do much in that terrain, I decided to head back for a truck right after I finished rolling the rock down the hill. I wedged the branch under the rock in several spots until it tilted up and gave way. The rock quickly picked up speed, thundering down the slope, with gravel and small rocks following in its wake. The slide was louder than I'd expected. As the rock neared the bottom, I saw something dart out from under the drop-off through the dust. I laughed, thinking I must have scared some poor animal. I finished watching the last of the rocks slide down, then returned to my three-wheeler. Just as I was about to start it, I heard the sheep bleating again, possibly startled by the noise. I turned and yelled, "I'll be right back," as I moved to kickstart the engine. But before I could, I caught sight of a gray mass moving rapidly towards me. In an instant, I was thrown from my three-wheeler. The blow came without warning. One moment, everything was right side up. The next, the world was spiraling out of control, flipping and tumbling. Ground, sky, blurring together as gravity pulled us down the jagged slope. I was entangled with something massive, its matted fur brushing against my face as we tumbled. The first few rolls poked and tore holes through my flannel, scraping my back and leaving me gasping for air. But it only got worse. With every turn, the creature that had knocked me off balance slammed into me, its body heavy, dense, reeking of rot. Each impact felt like it was breaking me apart, bone by bone. I felt the rock sliding beneath us. My head throbbed from rolling, but the creature was taking the brunt of each impact due to its size. Then a sudden pain near my waist pierced through my shirt. Claws, perhaps. But before I could even finish the thought, I came to a jerking halt. The creature tumbled off of me, its hulking mass rolling further down the hill. I clawed at the ground. My hand brushed against something tangled in my belt, a sagebrush. It had caught me, saving me from tumbling further. I struggled to my feet, disoriented. No matter what I did, I kept sliding, the gravel betraying me at every attempt. Then I heard a yelp and a whine from down below. I loosened my belt, freeing myself. I tried to stand and walk, but the hillside was unforgiving. I tried crawling on my knees, but the small rocks dug into them through my pants, my nerves making my legs spasm automatically. I thought I was stuck. I army crawled my way across the slope, desperate to escape whatever had tumbled away. The loose rocks shifted under my weight, but after what felt like an hour, I found a more stable spot and was able to stand up and run. The three-wheeler was on its side, with a puddle of gas seeping into the dirt from the vent hole on the gas cap. I did what I had done numerous times with that thing. I squatted down and tilted it upright by the handlebar and back fender. The engine, I knew, would be flooded. I held the throttle open to help the fuel settle. I didn't want to wait long, but I knew if I didn't give it a little time, it would flood further. As I waited, I heard it. Down below, my attacker. That thing was still there, trying to claw its way back up, its growls warped by the distance. What kind of creature wouldn't give up after that? I muttered to myself. I squinted, trying to see what it was. Its shape looked like a badger, but it was far larger than any badger could possibly grow. Maybe a wolverine, a large wild boar. It kept growling, sounding like something between a whine and a snarl. I could not stay any longer. I kicked the three-wheeler to life. I throttled hard as the engine purred. Just as I was about to speed away, I couldn't resist another look back. It wasn't there, but then I saw a silhouette rapidly zigzagging through the marsh. Good Lord, there's no way that thing is that relentless, I thought. In case it was coming back up the hill, I did not want to be there when it arrived, so I took off. My heart pounded as I pushed the machine. The wind howled in my ears as I tore across the hill, nearing 40 miles per hour. The tree line loomed ahead, and I slowed just enough to weave between the trunks. I turned north, knowing my way back to the trail. But as I did, I caught a glimpse of it. The creature had caught up with me, its dark shape darting between the trees. My panic surged. I veered south, crouching down over the handlebars, hoping to lose it. But my front tire hit something hard, jerking the front wheel up and slamming it back down, causing the headlight bulb to come loose and flicker like a strobe light. The creature dashed by, barely visible in the flickering light. I couldn't believe how fast it was. The forest began to thin, the open hill in sight. But then a violent shove from the side sent the back of my three-wheeler skidding, like I was drifting around a corner. I fought for control, but that thing rammed me again, harder this time, fully spinning me around. Instinctively, I clamped down on the brakes, causing the engine to stall. It was like I was momentarily deaf. All sound around me disappeared. The hair on my arms stood up, brushing against my shirt sleeves. My hands started to shake, and my jaw quivered. Then, a huge mass came around the front of my vehicle. In the moonlight, I could finally see it. It wasn't a boar at all, but something that resembled an absolutely massive wolverine. It growled so deeply, I swear I could feel it rattle my seat. It turned and looked at me, its eyes glowing orange with hatred. As if I wasn't scared enough, it stood up on two legs. It wasn't a wolverine at all. It looked more like a werewolf right from a movie. But seeing something like this in real life, up close, is far more terrifying than your wildest imagination. I naturally scooted backward, falling off the three-wheeler. Once on the ground, I kept scooting back. The creature slowly went to all fours and came around the side of the three-wheeler. I knew I couldn't outrun it, but I turned and ran anyway. I didn't make it 3 steps before tripping, landing face first. Then I felt it, a hand, an actual hand, wrapping around my left ankle. I turned over, barely able to twist my leg in the creature's grasp. The thing stretched out but not fully, pulling me towards it. Finally, something snapped in me and I panicked, but it was an angry and desperate panic. "You want to eat me?" I screamed, kicking wildly with my free leg and trying to pull myself back. Its mouth was open, and it looked just like a giant dog's head. My foot was getting close to its mouth, so I used my free foot and started to bash its head. This only seemed to enrage it. Its growl intensified. My foot wasn't doing much, so I did what you do to a normal dog if it attacks. I started to kick it in the nose as hard as I could, but it still would not release me. At this point, I was teary-eyed and sobbing when I felt a small fist-sized rock. I picked it up, leaned forward, and smashed that beast in the nose, then shoved the rock quickly into one of its eyes. It yipped and released my leg, swatting at me, before grabbing its face. I quickly rolled aside, got to my feet in one motion, leaping onto my machine, firing it up and taking off. I wasn't concerned about getting back to the trail, just focused on staying on the flattest area of the hill. I thought I heard a howl behind me, but I kept focused as the light flickered. I saw the southern fence off in the distance and stayed parallel to it, running over sagebrush and swerving around rocks. The engine drowned out any noise around me. Shadows appeared a ways away. Buildings. The old Mendez barn was up ahead. My machine was drawing me closer when I heard a hideous roar. It rattled me through my core, chills running through my body like a cold breeze on a hot day that makes you shudder. Then my three-wheeler started to jerk forward. As it did, I turned to look down and saw the thing's hands on both my tires, its claws digging in, followed by a slight hiss mixed in with the engine. It had slashed my tires. Revving the engine hard, the pierced tires spun free. The beast stumbled and tripped. My bike felt limp beneath me. The RPMs were high, but my speedometer read only 15 miles per hour. The farm was so close. Revving hard, the speedometer hit 20 as I coasted into the empty area, with old grain silos on the left and an old barn on the right. Before the three-wheeler even stopped, my feet hit the ground. I ran to the barn, pushing the door open and slipping inside, feeling around for a latch. My hand soon found the familiar groove. I reached past it, grabbing a handle, and pulled hard, sliding a metal bar across. I pushed on the door and it held. A moment of relief washed over me as I slid down to the dirt floor. My bike was still idling outside, its light still blinking through the barred opening of what looked like a feeding pen. Looking around and taking in the layout, I recognized the barn from a few years back, when my grandpa and I traded hay for a few calves from Julio. I remembered because my grandpa had me move the hay up to the loft, using the hay hood pulley. I looked down the middle of the barn, seeing the stalls and the barred windows. Sitting there, I felt my heart pounding, my skin clammy with a cold sweat that I only just noticed. Reality set back in. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the engine idled outside, I heard dense, heavy footsteps. No, I thought, panicking. Then my three-wheeler creaked. That's the sound of the frame under strain, being rocked back and forth, I thought, springing to my feet and making my way through the barn. Peering through a stall opening, I squinted into the flickering light and saw that werewolf-like thing, sniffing the air. Not my bike. It lifted my bike back and forth, letting out a low growl, before tossing it end over end like a toy. It gurgled, then gave one last sputter before falling silent. With the engine winding down, my eyes darted to each window. Surely that thing wasn't strong enough to rip the bars off, was it? Then came a bang, then another. Looking around in the dim light, it was hard to see what was happening. There was a bang and another crash. Then the other side of the barn. Bang. Catching a glimpse of it out the window, I could see it slamming into the barn. No way, I thought. It was trying to get in, break in. My stomach twisted as it circled the barn, testing different spots when the banging finally stopped. The scraping then began. Then ting, ting, ting as it dragged its claws across the bars. It stopped, sniffed the air, and turned, looking directly at me. What an awful sight those eyes were. I couldn't help but stare. They gleamed with a sick intelligence and malice. Standing there, I started to back up against the stall wall behind me. There was a raw snarl, arms reaching in, feeling around. Pulling its arms out, it clasped the bars and jerked them wildly. But they held. Gripping them again, it pried and pulled, a sharp metallic whine echoing through the barn. But the bars still held. The creature stood there staring in, eyes scanning around. Was it planning? Waiting? Or thinking? Its nails clicked against the bar it held, and it let out a hideous, loud roar before disappearing. I didn't know what was worse, the silence or the werewolf at the window. It seemed like hours went by, but I pulled up my sleeve and looked at my watch. Barely an hour had passed since the rock slide. It was nearing 9 p.m. Surely my grandparents and others would come looking for me by now. But before wishful thinking could settle in, I heard wood splintering. I expected it to pop at any moment. All I heard was scratching and growling. I looked around, running stall to stall, searching for anything to use to protect myself. In one of the stalls with no windows, I heard heavy breathing and scratching. The werewolf had found a small, softball-sized knothole, and it stuck its snout through the opening. After finishing my search in each stall, I was about to lose hope when I remembered my grandpa used to keep his bigger tools in the rafters above the stalls. I scanned the area and saw a shovel and pitchfork in the stall across from me. I quickly armed myself and went back to the windowless stall. It was still there, snout in the hole. It must have heard me as it pulled its muzzle out and looked in before reinserting its snout and growling loudly. I gathered my courage in whatever I was holding in my right hand, which was the pitchfork, and I brought it down hard on its nose. Even its nose felt tough as I tried to stick it in. Its muzzle waved wildly as it pulled it out of the hole and slammed itself into the wall in retaliation. The wall flexed a little, but didn't give. I immediately backed out of the stall, and in the barred window to the left, I could see it grasping the bars, trying to stick its whole head through. Its head barely fit through the bars, and it appeared to get stuck. I grabbed my shovel and ran into the stall, bringing it down on its head with all my might. A loud twang rang out. The creature now roared, wall shaking in its anger as it tried to get unstuck. I raised the shovel, about to smack it again, when I noticed the hook and eye bolt holding up the thick wood door that covered the bar windows. Using the shovel, I pushed the door up, and the hook released from the eye bolt. The door came flying down, smashing its nose and head. It hit the werewolf so hard that it knocked it free. Bang came a loud sound as the wall flexed in but didn't give. I ran to the other stalls and dropped those doors down. In the darkness, I could feel the anger of the creature. Whatever I'd done to make it relentless before, now I could feel an intense anger in its growl. The next thing I heard was it slamming itself against the door I had entered through. The hinges sang a metallic tone as they vibrated in its attempts to enter. Then came a strange sound, a thud in the dirt like a boulder had been dropped, followed by shuffling and another thud. Part of me dared not to peer out the crack between the door, but curiosity won, and I peeked out to see what looked like the creature jumping up. What was it after now, I thought. Then it clicked. The loft. It was trying to reach the rope hanging on the pulley to get in. With the windows closed, it was hard to see. There was very little light, but I felt my way to the ladder at the very end of the stalls. Reaching the top, I quickly swung the door open and looked around. The loft was much brighter than down below. I could hear the repeated thuds and failed attempts of the creature. After climbing into the loft, I cautiously made my way over to the open loft door and peered out from a distance. The thing was jumping, missing the rope by a foot or so. It stopped, sniffed the air, and looked right at me. It backed up to get a better look into the loft and at me. Then it went down to all fours and ran, leaping through the air, and its snout nipped the rope, which made it dance in the air. Before the beast could repeat the action, I scooted closer to the edge, reaching over and grabbing the rope, pulling it and the pulley of the hay hood back inside. Immediately, the creature let out a savage bark. My skin crawled. As scared as I was equally mad. I'd seen several big bales of hay as I crossed the loft. Looking around, I saw the hay track towards the back of the loft. I grabbed it. I hooked it up to the biggest bale using the attached tines on the track and the block and tackle, and pulled it down under the hay hood. I quickly switched the bale to the hay hood and got ready to swing out over the beast below. My plan was to swing the bale out and drop it on the thing. Looking down at it, I swung the bale out, but the hood wasn't long enough to reach the distance. Now, if it wasn't for the block and tackle pulley, that hay bale would have been almost impossible to hold on to. I lowered the bale in hopes of the creature getting curious and moving under it. As I lowered it several feet down, the creature took off. Dang it. Not even an instant later, the hay bale violently started to sway side to side and got a lot heavier. I nearly dropped it, but leaned back to counter the weight. In the commotion, the beast's arms appeared around the bale. Before it could steady itself in the swinging bale, I let go of the rope. The bale and creature plummeted down as one mass. The bale landed on the creature's upper body with a loud thud. I stood in shock that my plan had worked in a roundabout way. Looking down, I didn't see any movement. Nothing but a wrecked hay bale and a motionless animal. Part of me wanted to make a run for it, but I knew it would catch me if I did. I wasn't sure if the werewolf thing had been knocked out or was lying under the heavy bale waiting for me. Not wanting to leave the safety of the barn, I looked around the loft and saw several bales of hay. Using the hay track, I moved all the bales to the front of the loft, covering the opening and barricading myself inside. I climbed up to the top of several stacked bales and made my way to the wall just above the loft opening. I couldn't see outside, so I burrowed a little way down into the bales when I noticed the smell of old hay. It must have been wet at some point, and was probably the reason it was left up in the old barn. I thought I might be able to mask my scent, so I covered myself in it, lying still, so still for so long, I eventually passed out. Now, I don't remember dreaming or anything like that, but I do just remember waking up. There was a faint sniffing sound followed by a distant rustle. I went rigid as I put together the events of the night. It took all my courage to move an inch. I tilted my wrist towards my face and slowly slid up my sleeve. I peered at the glowing watch hands. It read 6:07 a.m. The rustling began again. It was almost rhythmic, then shallow sniffing followed, which was accompanied by a muffled sneeze. The fear set back in as my heart sank with despair. It took all my courage to snap me out of my frozen posture. I slowly rolled over and crawled to the edge of the bale. I feared looking over the side and having that beast's face staring right up at me. But when I looked, there was nothing. Slowly, I repeated this process for each side of the bale. What had I heard? It reminded me of when the sheep would nose the piece of hay when we fed them. Then an overwhelming thought entered my mind. The werewolf had somehow managed to get on the loft's edge and was digging through the bales of hay. Putting my head down near the bale, the sound returned. I started to tremble. I heard it sneeze again, the sneeze not so distant now. I slowly crawled up on my knees, getting ready to jump and make a run for the loft door. After moving so much, I think I had let that thing know I was close, as the rustling and sniffing intensified. Right as I was about to jump down, a head poked out of the bottom hay bale and caught my attention. It twisted and turned, trying to look around, but it struggled to look up at me. It growled a very low, menacing growl. Forget this, I thought, and jumped straight down, landing on its head and snout. It let out a ghastly sound. Landing on its head threw me off balance, and I fell just in front of it. Its head shook in anger and the hay bales followed, parts of the stacked bales starting to shake, and hay began to roll down like a rock slide. The bales started to slowly lift off the ground and then exploded as that nightmarish wolf-like thing sprung up, howling in victory. Not even making it to my feet, I scrambled across the floor to the loft door, cracking it open and sliding onto the 2x4 ladder below as the loft lid closed. I skipped many of the rungs as I quickly made my way down, the creature scratching and clawing at the door above me. By the time I was almost to the door, I could hear the hinges being torn out of place, and the door came crashing down, followed by a loud thud. I turned to see it once again standing on the other side of the barn. It started toward me, and turning around, feeling for the door, my hand found the latch and opened the barn door. I squeezed through, slamming the door behind me. I frantically looked at the door, found the latch, and slid it into place. Right as I did this, the door flexed out and the creature howled and snarled. I could hear it crashing back through the barn. Then silence followed for the briefest of seconds before the door flexed out again. This time it flexed out far. I could tell the door wasn't going to hold, being rammed from the inside as effectively as it had from the outside. I ran around the side of the barn, nearly crashing over my upside-down three-wheeler. I kept running, and the nearest thing I saw was the old grain silos. The first two didn't have ladders leading to the top, but I could see that the next one did. As I ran up to the silo, I started to climb it. Then I heard the barn door come crashing down. By the time I was near the top of the ladder, the creature was at the bottom of the silo, snarling like mad. Looking down at it, I could see it trying to figure out how to use the ladder, but after a rung or two, its nails scraped the side of the silo as it slid down. It kept staring up at me and started to circle the silo. I finished making my way to the little platform at the top of the dome. I couldn't see down below from this angle, but I could hear it below. Being up that high, the wind whipped around me. I was starting to get too cold. I looked at my watch. It was close to 6 a.m. It was about to be sunup. At least I thought it would be. But the night was fading slowly. After a few minutes, which felt like hours, it was silent down below. So I climbed back to the edge of the silo and peered over. It was still down there, just waiting. It looked up at me and attempted the ladder again, this time more fearsome than its last attempt. I quickly went back to the top of the silo. I thought I might be able to get into the silo, but if I did, it would really trap me. So I just sat there, as the beast kept trying to climb the ladder. That was when I saw the headlights in the distance. I wasn't sure if they could see me, but I began to jump up and down. The road they were on only led one way, and that was up to these silos and the barn on the side of the hill. As the lights got closer and closer, I believed they saw me. Soon I could hear the roar of an engine, then the suspension as it bounced down the rocky road. It crested the hill, and the headlights shone on the barn as it wound up ever so closely. I could make out the truck. It was Julio. It rolled up past the barn and stopped. I frantically climbed to the edge of the silo and looked down. It was still there, even with the truck, but its head was turned back looking at the vehicle. The truck just sat there, looking like a standoff between man and beast. The door swung open, and Julio stepped out with a 12-gauge. He was hollering something in Spanish. He rested it between the door and the door frame, aimed, and fired. I was looking straight down when this happened, and that beast let out an ear-piercing yip as fur flew from it. Then it turned and started toward him. I heard the familiar sound of the pump of the gun before another blast rang out. This time the creature shook hard and just stopped. Then another blast, and another. I knew if it was fully loaded, he only had 3 shots left. Then, as if by some blessing, the creature turned and ran off. Julio screamed at me to get down and beckoned me over. I didn't know if that thing was going to return or not, but I was frozen in place. "Come on," he yelled. "It might come back." I basically slid down the ladder, jumping into the truck. Julio climbed in. "Take this and reload it." He handed me the gun as he started to drive. He reached down to the CB radio and got a hold of my grandpa. "Harv, I got him. Over." Then my grandpa's voice came through. "Oh, thank goodness." My grandpa didn't even say over before Julio replied. Harv, you ain't gonna believe this. You remember a few years ago that thing I told you I saw? Well..." His voice trailed off, but he didn't let go of the mic button. "It's back, and it had your grandson trapped on top of my old silos. Over." "Well, just get back here. Let me talk to my boy. Over." Once back at the ranch, everyone hugged me. All the ranch hands and a few others were out looking for me, but hadn't gone out until after 10 to search. One of the hands looked at my back and stitched up several of the big gashes. After explaining everything, my grandpa and several others got in their vehicles to head to the marsh. I insisted on going along, getting into one of the trucks. When we got there, the sheep were gone, but we found them later that day. The part of the marsh that butted up against the ledge where the slope started was completely buried by rocks. One ranch hand said there was at least 2 semi-trucks loads of rocks, which must have come down, filling in the drop-off. Then he said something that made me realize why that thing wanted to hunt me down. He said there were 2 small caves. Possibly the thing had lived there. I had buried its home, or possibly buried others that might have lived down there. If wolves travel in packs, why not these creatures, if they're quite similar? After that morning, I have never seen anything like it since. A note from the author. My story was hard to tell, mainly hard to dramatize the events that happened to me, to give you the feeling that I was feeling that night. The scariest part was when it had me by the leg. That one rock saved my life. I still don't know how it withstood several blasts from a 12-gauge, but rock and pitchfork hurt it. All I know is, if it had managed to climb that ladder, I would have been a goner. I took care of the farm for a bit when my grandparents retired, and a few of my siblings helped. But my parents now run it full-time. There are scary things out there that I hope the rest of my family or others never have to encounter. Thanks for tuning in to Tales from the Break Room, the home of the scariest true work stories. If you want to hear your story narrated by me, send it to me at eeriecast.com/submit. We pay 5 cents per word for accepted stories. Help us grow by leaving Tales from the Break Room a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. Check out eeriecast.com or search for EerieCast on those very same podcast apps to see our other exciting and terrifying podcasts, like Unexplained Encounters, the other show I host, where I read stories with a focus on the supernatural. To get some merch, go to eeriecast.store. And to unlock ad-free episodes of your favorite EerieCast shows and exclusive audiobooks, Go to eriecast.com/plus and consider signing up for EerieCast Plus. You can follow me on Twitter, I guess it's X now, @DarkPrevails. You can also subscribe to me on YouTube, where I deliver the same content. Just look for Darkness Prevails. Good night. I hope we can share another break sometime soon.